Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on a data-driven approach to combating counterfeit goods in e-commerce. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm the director of the Center for Data Innovation. The Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focusing on the intersection of data technology and public policy. Today's event is focused on the question of counterfeit goods, and in particular on the role and responsibility of e-commerce platforms and others in the private sector to address this problem. The Department of Homeland Security and the National IPR Center have worked with industry over the last few years to offer best practices for how stakeholders can address this problem. But implementing these best practices is obviously an iterative process. I think there's a lot of learning that goes into this, and every platform is different. So what we're trying to do today with this event is really explore the size and the scope of the problem of counterfeiting, the efforts that are being made today to combat counterfeiting on these platforms, and discuss how government and the private sector should be working together to address this problem moving forward. In terms of format, for everyone joining us today, this program is meant to be interactive, and your questions are definitely welcomed. You're invited to submit any questions you have for the panelists using our platform Slido. If you're watching this video on the center's website, you'll see a link at the bottom of the page. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll see a link to the Slido Q&A page in the event description. And of course, we also encourage you to share your thoughts and reactions to the event on Twitter or social media using the hashtag Data Innovation. So to begin, let me introduce our panel briefly. We have Matt Allen, Director of the National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center, Krista Brzezowski, Senior Manager of Public Policy at Amazon, Sarah Decker, Senior Director of Federal Government Affairs with Walmart, and Piotr Strasowski, Senior Economist at OECD in charge of illicit trade issues. So a really fantastic set of panelists with us today to discuss this issue. Thank you all for being here today. Matt, I just want to start with you to kind of kick us off in this discussion. First, let's do a little scene setting here. Not everyone thinks about counterfeits and fake goods every day, but a lot of people that shop online have experienced this or think they might have experienced this. So can you talk a little bit about what's the impact of counterfeit goods on businesses and consumers? Why is this an issue we should care about?
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate the opportunity to join you today. And on behalf of the 27 organizations that make up the National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center, we thank you for the opportunity to talk, at least, initially from a U.S. perspective. And it's great to have Piotr on as well. Kind of frame it a little bit with the understanding that, when I give statistics, not all of them have specifically to do with online marketplaces, but, from a holistic point of view, counterfeiting and IP infringement really does affect consumers in many, many ways. First, I think from the U.S. point of view, as an economy that's really founded on innovation, it goes to the foundations and erodes the foundations of the economic, engine that drives the U.S. economy and economies globally. But there's also more material impacts on consumers, in the United States and elsewhere. One of the major ones that we focus on as our highest priority is public health and safety. A lot of the things that are counterfeited are not necessarily what we would call luxury goods or consumer goods. They're products that consumers rely on for their health and safety. And when they buy things, they buy them with the idea that they are formulated in the way that the manufacturer originally intended them to be. And that are going to do exactly what a manufacturer markets them for. And when you erode that confidence, you really do harm the consumers, as I said, in very material ways. Also, maybe to frame the challenge that we face a little bit, just with some numbers, just from a law enforcement point of view, the challenge is growing. And again, these are numbers that don't just focus on the online world, but counterfeiting and IP infringement more generally. The DHS agencies in 2000 made about 3,244 seizures of counterfeit goods. In 2018, that had jumped tenfold to 33,810 seizures of counterfeit merchandise. Another way to look at it, again, not necessarily the most perfect way, is what the manufacturer's suggested retail price for those goods are. And in 2003, the goods that we seized were valued at an MSRP of about $94 million. And in 2018, 1.4 billion was the MSRP of the goods that we seized. And I can tell you that while we don't have full data, that's gone up because just this year, in one large seizure in one location, we believe that the MSRP for the goods that we seized was $1 billion out of one seizure. So the scale and the scope of the problem continues to grow. And again, that's not just, I want to just continue to kind of qualify those numbers. Those are goods that aren't just being sold online. That's wherever we seize them.
Yeah. Peter, I mean, you look at this in quite a lot of depth in some of your research, looking at the economic impact and the size and scope of this problem. Can you weigh in on that as well, what you're seeing in, not only the United States, obviously, but around the world?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you for having me today. Well, I can just echo what Matt has said. It's a big problem that hits at the heart of today's modern knowledge-based economies. What we see is that, of course, we are all surrounded today by intellectual property, right? Every product that we use is loaded with intellectual property, ranging from patents, high technologies, to design and brands. And that gives an opportunity for criminals to free ride on it, to steal this intellectual property, and to pollute markets with counterfeits, right, with fake goods. And at the same time, this crime seems to be a relatively low priority in many countries. This is not perceived as, a big crime. For criminals, it involves in lower risks than, say, smuggling of narcotics, right? So this is a high revenue, low risk crime. And we see it in our data. So we do estimates of global trade in counterfeit goods. And what we see is that 2 years ago, global trade in counterfeits amounted to $460 billion. 460 billion US dollars, right? This is a tremendous number. It's order of magnitude of GDPs of countries, right? This is not a jackpot in a lottery. This is GDPs of countries. It's huge business. And again, as Matt said, we are not only talking about luxury goods, because luxury products are also targeted by criminals, but basically everything that is protected with IP becomes a target. And these days, at the time of the pandemic, we will see lots of fake medicines, fake personal protective equipment. We've even seen counterfeit COVID vaccines. It's every product that is IP protected becomes a target, posing, of course, big consequences, not only economic ones for innovative companies, but also health and safety risk for consumers.
That's right. And Krista, I mean, we've been talking about this from the consumer perspective, but we also see this from the business perspective. Can you share some of that?
Yeah, sure. And first, let me thank you and the Center for Data Innovation for putting this all together today and having us on the panel. And I have to say, it's a real honor to be with Piotr and Sarah and Matt as well, folks that I've worked with over the years and in different capacities, and just really applaud their commitment to this issue and their leadership. And I think having this great group today really attests to the fact that this is a really important problem, and that we need to keep it on the front burner. So thanks to you guys as well. But yeah, from the Amazon perspective, the impact of counterfeits on goods, and I'm sure Sarah sort of shares this, is really an issue of just maintaining the trust with our customers. I mean, Amazon is not only a global company, so sort of dealing with this across different stores, but we want to make sure that the goods that are coming to our consumers are what those customers are purchasing, that they're, as Piotr said and Matt said, authentic and safe. And we also want to make sure that the sellers on our stores are not having sort of their sales and their brands undercut by sort of inauthentic products and illegitimate competitors. So as I said, this is a real priority for us. And we look at it as an opportunity to make sure that we're able to build, maintain, and keep the trust of our customers. And that receipt of a counterfeit product or a bad experience could really erode that. And so from that perspective, both as a global company as well as a host of a lot of businesses online, the impact can be quite detrimental, and therefore we're really committed to working with others to address it.
Thanks for that. And Gail, I want to stay with you for a moment and ask if you can talk a little bit about kind of the origins of, as you mentioned, this is a high revenue, low risk crime. Who's profiting from this? What's driving this? How is it entering the U.S. market? And how much of this, we sometimes think about, retail crime as shoplifting and kind of this kind of very kind of one-off, low-level offenders. But now we're seeing more and more organized retail crime, and I wonder if you can kind of expand on basically what's the linkage between this really high-value activity that's occurring here, and where all that money is going, and how it's being used.
It's an excellent question, actually, that could merit a whole 1 hour chat about the dynamics behind the scenes. And I've been working on this issue for many years, and every time I start digging into it, I'm surprised with a new finding, right? So let me just give some key bullets to refer to your question: what's behind it, where these goods come from, what are the dynamics. So firstly, let me recall it's a multi-billion-dollar business, right? This is not backyard, small-scale enterprise run by those who cannot afford real goods. No, it's a globalized business. Counterfeiting is a globalized business that exploits governance gaps, that exploits the fact that brands bring trust, and trust brings profit opportunities for those who want to free ride, right? It's a globalized business. Trade routes are also very globalized, right? So this is not old-fashioned smuggling somewhere in small boats. No, smugglers abuse modern logistical solutions that are fantastic, right? Trade is fantastic. Modern trade is fantastic. Without Amazon, without Walmart, we would not have half of these goods in my room. My kids would kill me. So trade is great, right? But counterfeiters that run illicit trade networks know how trade operates. They know how to abuse these modern solutions, such as e-commerce, such as fast parcels, such as free trade zones, to get through, to pollute these ways with counterfeits. Where these goods come from? Well, most of these goods, as most any goods, come from China, right? When we look at the map of routes in fake goods, we see that most of these goods originate from China. The trade routes are complex in order to, blur the country of origin, in order to turn customs and enforcement officers' life into a hell. So on the way, there are many parties that are involved in this process. And these parties also, as I said, abuse modern solutions to get into the US. How do they do it? Well, there's legal supply chains and legal ways of getting to the US, right? Currently, the volumes of trade are so humongous that it's virtually impossible to do manual checks of every parcel that enters the US and open every container that goes into it. At the same time, it's hard to tell whether a good is fake or not, right? So the best strategy counterfeiters can do is to make sure that the documents they provide will hide the true nature of these goods. They forge documents, they reroute the goods via some free trade zones or intermediate points to make sure that they were below on the radar screen of customs.
Yeah. Matt, I wanted to ask if you could weigh in on this as well, especially, from the U.S. perspective. I mean, this is something that obviously, DHS is very concerned about, and, how are we trying to address that? And how is that changing with these new dynamics that you had mentioned?
So, earlier, Peter talked a little bit about IP theft and counterfeiting being a low risk and high reward endeavor, and that is very much the case. For about a dozen years, I worked on the U.S. southern border, our border with Mexico, and as Piotr mentioned, a lot of our focus on our southern border is focused at what's coming at us. So what is the drug threat that emanates from Mexico? But make no mistake about it, the same cartels that are involved in drug trafficking into the United States are also very well diversified. They're very, very agile organizations, and they pivot to look for any opportunity to make money, particularly when that criminal endeavor has a lower risk of going to prison, either in the United States or in Mexico. And so in Mexico, cartels are behind things like stealing oil from the Mexican oil companies, but they're also involved in importing counterfeit merchandise into Mexico. And that's where, I think many Americans and even U.S. law enforcement officers don't necessarily recognize that the U.S. Is either a source or a transit point for counterfeit merchandise that's making its way from Asia through the United States into places like Mexico and further south. It's not just a U.S. and a Mexican phenomenon. But as Piotr mentioned, the organizations take advantage of a very complex global environment in which trade moves. And so taking advantage of the in-bond system that allows goods to transit one country to on its way to another is something that the cartels have taken advantage of in order to move things as innocuous as cigarettes that emanate from Asia through the United States into Mexico and other places around the world. So it's really a challenging problem, and the kinds of organizations that are involved in it are very much the kinds that you would associate with other criminal activities like drug trafficking.
Thanks, Matt. And Sarah, I want to bring you in on this conversation, both from the perspective, we've seen a lot of points raised already, how counterfeit goods impact businesses, and then also just, how, in describing this problem, people think of Walmart, of course, as, one of the, world's largest, experienced companies managing logistics. And yet you're facing organized criminal operations that are trying to exploit that. So, how are you thinking about, the scope of that challenge and how you're protecting consumers?
Sure. Well, and I'll echo Krista's comments. Thanks for allowing us to participate in this panel. It's great to see so many friendly faces and partners in this effort to combat counterfeits. I think Krista nailed it on the head. A lot of it from a company perspective is about trust. And for us, the trust of the customer is the number one priority. So we have a business motivation to really address this issue. It's also the trust of the sellers that use our marketplace, making sure that their brand and their intellectual property is protected. And I think I'd add a third layer to that. It's a trust that those sellers are who they say they are. And so that's why Walmart has really focused our business model around a curated marketplace to verify our sellers before they have access to the marketplace. And that's allowed us to keep prevalence of counterfeits down to 0.001%. Which we think is a great statistic. Would obviously love to get that to zero, but it is a complex issue with a complex supply chain. Going back to Matt's opening comments about it not just being luxury goods, but with COVID, public health items, safety items were definitely a target. When you think about it, crime organizations follow the money. And so we proactively, in anticipation of some of those customer demands during COVID, went into our marketplace and did things like brand gated to make sure that only Clorox, a trusted brand, would be able to sell on our marketplace. And so I bring that up to say that the organization behind this is very iterative. You can't say, oh, they're just going to go after this one product, because they will change just as customer demand changes. And then I'll add on to that to say that even if we were to find them on our marketplace and terminate them, we're not the only marketplace out there. And so they're iterative in the channel that they use to get their products, their fake products, out into the supply chain. And so I think a lot of what we'll talk about today is sort of the partnerships we have to address some of that. And for us, when you talk about organized retail crime, shoplifting in our stores, we have a long ongoing relationship with law enforcement via our global investigations team to address that issue. We want to be a partner to get these bad actors out. And I think that same concept absolutely applies digitally online.
Thank you, Sarah. And if I can stay with you for a minute, I know some people that are probably tuning into this are maybe not fully aware of all the changes that have been going on in e-commerce. So many people, when they go online and they're shopping, they haven't realized that really one of the reasons there's an explosion of, different opportunities to buy online on platforms like Amazon and Walmart are because you have these third-party marketplaces. So I was just wondering if you could maybe take a minute to explain a little bit about that evolution, why Walmart's kind of gone down this path. And Krista, if you'd like to jump in on this as well, I'd invite you to. But then also how that's changed how you think about counterfeits maybe today versus how you were thinking about it 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, it all comes back to the customer, and what really is driving Walmart's marketplace is how many items can we get that our customers demand? How many of those can we make available to them? And there's only so much we can do as Walmart, and then we depend on those third-party sellers to curate and create that selection that we know customers want. We're probably far behind Amazon on some of that selection choices, but working our way towards that. As far as how we've evolved over the past 5 years, I will say we are still actually a very nascent marketplace, but we started from the beginning with trust and safety as our priority. So our business model from the very beginning was designed to limit the sale of counterfeit goods. And again, that sort of goes all the way back to verification of our third-party sellers. That is a process that impedes our ability to grow, but we think it is so important to have that customer trust that we've maintained it today.
Thank you. Krista, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, please. I mean, I think what Sarah said about the selection, the price, the speed. I mean, these are certainly critical elements that I think as Amazon is coming to the table, that you've seen change with e-commerce. I mean, being able to get a delivery of a Halloween costume for your kid within a couple of days is certainly something that we've seen change from a few years ago. But yeah, that introduces a whole new host of problems. I mean, the supply chains are still very diverse. You see a lot of different actors in the space, from the online marketplaces to the logistics providers to the various handoffs and the payments that are made. And sort of the discussion and the role of social media plays in sort of advertising and directing customers to various products. So certainly a big change over the last 5 years in this space, and I think that's why it's just ever more important for the collaborations to also grow and evolve. With I think what we're going to be talking about in a little bit, with information sharing really being the heart of that, to try to tighten up these seams and make sure that there's collaboration across the entire space, so that, as Piotr said, that the great aspects of e-commerce and trade can continue to thrive, but that we're all better at finding and holding accountable the folks that are taking advantage of some of these great new innovations.
Yeah, and that in-time delivery is so key, and that's where the logistics become so important. And I would add one other player to that list that Krista mentioned. It would be the U.S. Postal Service, right? And so we, for a long time, had required our third-party sellers to have a U.S. location, which ultimately meant most of them were bulk importers versus using that Postal Service system. That creates a whole slew of other issues at the CBP that I won't get into as a topic today, but it truly is a whole supply chain issue, and I think it does require creative and strong partnerships to address.
Well, so those are the partnerships I want us to spend some time talking about, and maybe Matt, I'll have you kind of kick off this part of the discussion. The IPR Center, spent quite a bit of time working with the private sector. Forming the e-commerce working group, this action group, the anti-counterfeiting consortium, to identify online nefarious actors. It really, I think, spearheaded this idea of saying, government needs to be working very closely with the private sector to figure out how to deal with e-commerce and counterfeits. You put out a set of recommendations for both government and the private sector. Then there was this report that came out more recently, following up on what's been occurring in that space. I wanted to ask if you could kind of maybe just take again, for people who haven't been following this, walk through kind of the genesis of this idea, what the engagement looked like, what the outcomes are, and kind of where you see things now.
Sure. I think, Krista and Sarah have kind of talked a little bit about this from the perspective of the e-commerce platforms and corporate America. But, there's some common themes there. And that's, the IPR Center has been kind of working with, we're built around working with the private and public sector to kind of look at the challenges of IP theft and counterfeiting. But the key things that they've hit on is that, as Sarah mentioned, if Walmart shuts down a third-party vendor, it's not going to be too surprising that they either already had a presence on another platform or migrate to another platform. And, I have been in this department both before 9/11 and after 9/11. And one of the ways that federal law enforcement changed is all about information sharing. I think, we all learned a lot of lessons that came out of the tragic terrorist incident of 9/11. And it really came down to information sharing. And so what we've been doing in the e-commerce working group is very analogous to that. I think for us, from a criminal investigative point of view, a lot of our world has changed in terms of using data to drive investigations. And the e-commerce working group applies a lot of those same principles in a non-competitive way between the companies. And that's where I think the companies, both the platforms and hopefully in the very near future, the other parts of that ecosystem, whether it's the express consignment companies or the postal service or the payment processors, the more data we can get from that entire ecosystem together to kind of compare notes and look across those platforms and that ecosystem for bad actors, the better off we will be. And what the e-commerce working group really worked to do was to bring together the parts of that ecosystem in a non-competitive way to kind of share data, share experience, and share their observations about people that are operating on their networks, and then do what we can to identify the criminal organizations that we've been talking about earlier that are operating out there. We hit a very important milestone in the last year. 4 of the e-commerce platforms together selected a subcontractor that will serve as that repository for their data that they put out there, that will normalize and anonymize the data so that they can do analysis of it across platforms. The next, I think, milestone for us and the next level of difficulty will be trying to get the e-commerce, or not the express consignment companies and postal service information and payment processor information into that same kind of an ecosystem or that environment where we can look more broadly about where that criminality is happening.
Thanks. Krista and Sarah, I want to invite you in on this question as well. I mean, Krista, I know you also come at this from before Amazon with your experience in government. But just thinking about this really essential question about now that there's more data available, what can be done? And I'd love to hear your reactions to that.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area that I'm really, really excited about. I mean, I think the support of the IPR Center was really instrumental in, and that's not just because you're on, Matt, but the support of the IPR Center was really instrumental. I mean, sharing data is tough, and companies can be reluctant to do it amongst themselves. And having the government really at the table and providing being a bit of a cheerleader at the side, it did give the private sector the opportunity to really do what we should be doing, which is collaborating amongst ourselves, trying to share information about sort of the known entities that we've taken actions against. Those could be really valuable risk signals to everyone else. And so sort of fostering that exchange and allowing that to develop through this initial pilot, I really applaud the leadership there at the IPR Center and also the colleagues that are participating in it. As we're talking about sort of the unique aspects of e-commerce and sort of what folks can be doing, I mean, I do think information and data is going to really be at the heart of this. Understanding that these bad actors are going to be, sort of taking stolen identities and using information that might be available on the dark web and elsewhere to really try to exploit all the benefits of sort of a digital online world. We need to be just as savvy, and it's I think it's incumbent on us to sort of figure out the means and the ways to do that. to be really thoughtful, of course, about the information that we're using and how we're sharing it and how we're securing it. But that to be forward-leaning in information sharing is a bit of a default in this area, where these are folks that we've removed from our platform, and that we need to, not just remove them from our platform and sort of call it a day, but to ensure that they're not exploiting other seams in the supply chain. So really excited about this pilot activity. And hoping to achieve even more going forward, more participants beyond sort of online marketplaces, and really try to expand the ways that information and the analysis, the information that's going in and the analysis that's coming out, just reaches a broader array of folks that could find value in it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Sarah, very similar question to you. I'd also be interested in, Walmart was participating obviously in these conversations as well, and what you're seeing is, the opportunity to use some of this analytics. I know you commented earlier that Walmart has such a low rate of counterfeits on its platform, but as you said, your goal isn't just to get them off of Walmart. Your goal is to not just allow them to bounce up somewhere else.
Yeah, I think I'll pivot back to my previous comment. We have a long-standing relationship with law enforcement in particular, where when we do find bad actors, we do think it's important to be a private-public partner in that space. And, I think Krista summarized the points well. Thanks.
So, Peter, I want to ask you to jump in on this question as well, because right now this pilot is U.S. focused, obviously. But some of your work has shown the global nature of counterfeiting. To what degree, we have a lot of transatlantic dialogues right now. There's a number of OECD projects I know also focus on these questions about collaboration among OECD member countries around issues such as data sharing, going after cybercrime. Are there more opportunities that we should be looking at to addressing this significant problem, not just in a kind of country by country basis, but expanding that, and what might that look like?
Well, thank you. It's an excellent question. And let me also say big kudos to IPR Center for your proactive role, not only in actually guiding the anti-counterfeiting work, but also showing how to structure governance to counter this problem. Of course, we all say information sharing, right? And I see that people use the term information sharing like a holy grail. But it's difficult to share information also because counterfeiting doesn't have a ministry or department anywhere, right? There's no ministry of anti-counterfeiting in any of the countries that I am aware of, right? And that's why IPR Center is so important, because it shows the way forward. But that's also why information sharing is so difficult. You need to bring to one table people from different departments, different units, and also e-commerce that is borderless means that you also need to bring people from different countries, right? Some of them might use centimeters, others might use inches. But information sharing, as I said, it's the key, but it's very difficult just to overcome institutional problems that refer to it. At the same time, you also add one point. Information sharing is indeed important, but at the same time, often you don't need much to achieve some success. The ecosystem is complex, but it doesn't require humongously complex technology to solve many of these issues. For example, well, in the pandemic, I ordered lots of stuff online, and many of this stuff arrives in small parcels from a third country, not from the US, not from the EU, from abroad. And when I look at the papers that are attached to it, it's mostly paper, right? So lots of information is still exchanged using very old-fashioned, non-digital way. So we're not talking about new cyber solutions. We are just talking about digitizing some of the information and sharing it in real time, not waiting till the next week or month.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, there's no counterfeit row, right? Like to your point, you don't just go to one place and find them, right? And I do think to take that a little bit further, one really important role I think between the public and private sector is an ongoing conversation to better understand how the marketplaces work, right? And so the example I'm thinking in my mind is we are a business to consumer marketplace, so B2C, that's an industry term. But what that means in practice is some of our third-party sellers ship directly to the consumer. So we as a marketplace never see the item, never touch the item. And so it's difficult for us without counting on our brand partners or our customers or anyone who can go online and report a counterfeit. It's difficult for us to capture the full universe without that partnership. And I think, it becomes even more complex when you look at some of the marketplaces that are consumer to consumer. And so I just think it's an ongoing policy issue where it's really, really important to understand those different dynamics because from an ITIF perspective, when you get closer to starting to hold those marketplaces liable for products, that's when you're really talking about hindering the innovation and the product selection and the product efficiency that all customers are gaining out of this business model. So I think that's just an important point to keep in mind.
Thanks, Sarah. And maybe I can stay with you for a minute because in that DHS report that we were talking about, there were, 10 different recommendations that came out of it. And, I know different platforms took those back and reported on their progress as of last year. And obviously there's been additional change since then. But, I think some of the, high priority ones were things like, verifying seller's identity, establishing marketplace seller IDs, disclosing country of origin, having, clear notice and takedown procedures. I wanted to ask if you could comment on either those or others that you think are a priority, any that, you think maybe don't work for the platform or, just kind of where the state of this is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that probably I would say the top priority right now from our perspective, as well as maybe from a congressional perspective, would be verification of third-party sellers, as well as disclosure to the customer when they are dealing with a third-party seller. In fact, just today, the House Energy and Commerce Committee is taking up legislation called Informed Consumers Act, and it's something we strongly support as a way to sort of build trust within the ecosystem and establish those best practices across the board. One issue I will take up that I think we wouldn't agree with would be the country of origin labeling. That's something that is very difficult to accurately determine. Again, we're not necessarily the manufacturer of these products. And so to be able to accurately decide which country a product that may have been assembled in one area, put together in another, had different parts coming in from different countries, that becomes very difficult to do. And for those who are in trade policy, it's been a outstanding, very difficult practice, even in the physical world. And so, and then I think there's a question as to how helpful is that to the consumer? I'm not sure that consumers necessarily shop based on country of origin. And if this is truly about addressing counterfeits versus some other perhaps geopolitical concerns out there, then I really do think the verification process would be most effective.
Thank you. And Krista, similar question to you. Amazon's obviously looked at many of these issues as well. What's your take on those recommendations and where you stand with them?
Yeah, I mean, the DHS report and I think as Piotr said, the other global best practice frameworks that you see at the national, that you see at the international level, provide really helpful starting points that allow us, online marketplaces, other private sector intermediaries, and frankly governments to start thinking about these challenges and solutions sort of through a common lens. So they're really immensely valuable in that way. I'd echo Sarah's point about, of course, the need for flexibility and the ability to sort of iterate on these. We've learned lessons as we look to deploy certain approaches, and I think weaving those lessons back into the dialogue and keeping these fresh and relevant and sort of germane to the evolving tactics of some of these bad actors is really important. I'm actually a lot of the best practices that you see in the DHS report, Amazon has, or we either have, or have already in place or incorporated because of the report. A lot of those suggestions into what we're doing with our own anti-counterfeiting and sort of broader brand protection approaches. So they were really relevant and really helpful. Actually, I'll put a plug in for folks that are a little bored this weekend and need some light reading. We enumerate a lot of kind of our approach to brand protection in our brand protection report, which is sort of the first one we've ever done, and lays out in a comprehensive way, all the various tools and investments that we've made in this space. And I think as you take a look, you'll see a lot of alignment with the DHS best practices, other best practices and global norms. Again, to echo Sarah a bit, like things that are absolutely necessary, are some of the robust, proactive controls that you see advocated for by DHS and those best practices. Things like comprehensive terms of service and express prohibitions against counterfeiting. I mean, they seem simple, but they're absolutely necessary and things that Amazon fully supports. I think we'll talk more about AI and machine learning, but having those tools available and having a means for customers to have the contact information and have a history of customer complaints so that they can make informed choices. Having that type of thing is something Amazon does have through public-facing versions of sort of seller IDs. We also think that having tools for brands is another sort of category in these tools or in these best practices that are really indispensable. So brands themselves, who are really the experts on their own products, are empowered to search the store, to find any suspected counterfeits, and even take them down directly themselves, and not wait for us to have to do it. On the premise that they're really in the best position to know their products. So we want to empower them to be able to do that and to have those efficient notice and takedown procedures in place. And then the final category that I see, good alignment between what we're doing and many of the best practices, including the DHS ones, are this really important final third step about, again, not only ensuring that the bad actors are removed from our store, but that they're held accountable. That you remove the product for sale, of course, but then you also take the additional steps to investigate related accounts and to withhold funds and to destroy that inauthentic inventory, so you're not seeing those same inauthentic goods re-entering the supply chain somewhere else. And then really having in place tools and capabilities and teams to partner with brands and to partner with law enforcement to hold these guys accountable, to pursue civil litigation and criminal prosecution, so that you actually see improve the deterrent effect that I think we've all sort of seen and talked about today. It's just not strong enough right now to be preventing in any meaningful way this type of activity.
Thanks, Krista. Pia, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yes, thank you. I fully agree with what Krista and Sarah have said. Actually, I just want to highlight, it's great to have platforms, delegates together with us, because that shows that platforms are also interested in getting rid of counterfeits from platforms, at least some platforms, right? And what I believe in is that best practices that we are developing to get rid of counterfeiting from platforms should be developed with platforms, right? Because that's the way to identify what best practices do make sense, what practices are relevant, what is doable, right? At the same time, e-commerce is easy. It's just one click away from one platform to another. It's very easy to move from Amazon to Alibaba. So coordination matters as well in that context. We should make sure that those best practices that are developed in a set of platforms will also apply in those that, well, are just one click away. And two more things I would like to add. First is, of course, best practices will only work for those that, well, that look for it, right? We see that many consumers deliberately look for counterfeits online, especially when it comes to goods that do not pose health and safety threats. There are some unfortunate trends like, hype dupes or, nice, cool fakes. This is just unfortunate, right? And for this, as Krita says, some prosecution, so accountability should be also paralleled together with best practices, right? Those who sell these goods and those who demand them knowingly, they should know that this is not a victimless crime. This is against the law, and some prosecution should be also done in that context. And the second thing, just let me recall that it's great to see platforms with us. Earlier this year, we had a set of workshops at the OECD to identify what platforms can do to go this extra mile. And I was really happy to have Walmart, Amazon, but also other platforms with us. Of course, platforms will not solve all the problems, right? Platforms do not have a silver bullet. But still, we should keep in mind that platforms can do this extra mile to limit this problem, at least by a bit, right? Where other bits are still within the hands of enforcement authorities, police, education systems.
Thanks for that. And I think that's a really great point. And Matt, I want to turn to you for this. I mean, as was just said, this whole engagement that the IPR Center has done with the private sector is actually very unique in terms of when you look at policy making that's going on right now, as in respect to online platforms and concerns about problems on the internet. There's often a kind of regulate first and then see if it worked, as opposed to really working with the private sector hand in hand to see what are the best options and evaluate them and iterate on it. So I think it's just a phenomenal example of a very effective way of engaging with important problems. I wanted to ask, kind of as you're looking forward now, into what these best practices that were laid down in this report have achieved so far, and how you move forward. How do you anticipate, continuing to work with the private sector, and in particular, it seems like a lot of the platforms are very engaged on this, but there's obviously, the other stakeholders, the payment processors, the shippers. I know some of them have been involved in this as well. What do you see as kind of the next stage of this engagement?
Well, it's to move to that next level of complexity. I think we have a core group in the e-commerce working group that have really come forward, and I think set the standard in terms of corporate responsibility, in terms of being willing to kind of share in ways that we haven't had people do before, and I think sharing to the point where it's uncomfortable. And it's definitely not an easy process. Earlier Piotr talked about being able to migrate from platform to platform with a click. I think one of my takeaways in just a short time here at the IPR Center is that it's not as simple as some people would make it out to be. Earlier when I talked about normalizing data, I think when you start peeling back that onion, you find out that it's not as simple, and that particularly bad actors that are migrating from platform to platform are doing things consciously to obfuscate and hide who they are and where they operate. And so it's not as simple as some would have it be thought. But with that said, going to the next level and getting cooperation from the express consignment industry, who I would say is also kind of standing in the wings, and our sense from being that pivot point at the IPR Center, wants to come forward and share their data as well, and then getting the next degree of difficulty getting payment processor data, I think will also just take us to the next level, and be able to look much better at that ecosystem. I think one of the unique perspectives that we enjoy by being at the IPR Center, and Sarah, I think, alluded to it, and I've heard it alluded to a couple of times. I think what we see the marketplaces want is what I would call an even playing field. Both in the United States, and then when you talk about Europe and other parts of the world, recognizing that many of them are either or are becoming more global organizations. They want to be able to navigate a more rational regulatory regime globally, not just in the United States. And so the more that we can do to identify to help the licit and legitimate marketplaces work with law enforcement, and then frankly identify the outliers and focus that criminal law enforcement, civil law enforcement on the marketplaces that are the outliers and maybe more conscious in their avoidance of responsibility is where we want to be. I think of the, if you want to kind of highlight the difference, think of the two words dark web, which, in my world has a very negative connotation. We want to make sure that is viewed very differently than e-commerce more generally, because those are two vastly different worlds.
Right. So I want to remind those who are watching that we welcome your questions. If you'd like to submit them, there's a link to Slido on the Data Innovation website, as well as in the description of the YouTube video. Before we turn to that, I have one more question. Krista, you had mentioned this earlier, and I'll direct this to you and anyone else that wants to weigh in on it as well. The role of artificial intelligence and analytics, as we're collecting more data, and as platforms are getting smarter, and you're able to also bring in data potentially from the shippers and the payment processors, what are the opportunities here to use analytics to identify counterfeits, to help stop these networks, to help customs officials identify this, as well as even maybe in some of the actual warehouses where some of these items lay? Are there opportunities to actually physically identify some of these objects? I want to direct this to you first, Krista, and then anyone else who wants to weigh in. And Krista might be frozen, so if that's the case, I'll see if anyone else
am I
wants
back on?
There you go. There you go. You're good. We can see you and hear you, Krista.
We can see you.
Oh, you can see us.
Oh, I'm back on. Can you see me?
Yeah, you're good. Thanks.
I'm sorry about that. Love it working from home. But yeah, I think you were asking about the role that AI can play. And yeah, from our perspective, the bottom line is that we want to be really proactive and work upstream to prevent abuse before it ever impacts a customer or one of our selling partners. We take this super seriously. We're proud of the fact that 0.01% of the products we've sold have ever received a counterfeit complaint. But like Sarah, we want that number to be zero, and we want to sort of stop this activity across the space, not just in our store. And frankly, the ability to have information, as well as the capacity to sort of analyze and draw conclusions from that data is really vital. And I think everyone on this panel would agree. We need to be able to identify the trends, uncover connections, connect the dots, I guess is an overused term, but one that applies, and do that in a way that's really foundational to combating, counterfeits, yes, but also broader criminal activity across the globe. So this is what we do in Amazon. Is very much akin to what I'm sure Matt's familiar with as targeting in the U.S. government. Again, trying to keep step with today's counterfeiters who are global themselves, who are operating across the space, across jurisdictions, across borders, across different modes of transport, and really exploiting any silos or seams that may exist within government or frankly within industry. So that's an area where we're really committed. We've got an international team of over 8,000 investigators, data scientists, engineers, analysts, business leaders who really just are focused on building tools and building the capacity to do this sort of preventative work. We incorporate, and I think this is one of the benefits of AI and machine learning, is that the data can the data and the lessons that we learn can just sort of be plowed back in and make the targeting systems even smarter and more effective. We look at 45 million pieces of consumer feedback or customer feedback a week, and that just makes the tools even more sophisticated and more effective. But to Buick's point as well, information sharing doesn't have to be all about sort of fancy bells and whistles and AI and machine learning. I think there's tremendous value there, but his point about digitizing paper, using sort of old-fashioned or low-tech, if you will, solutions could also be really effective. And as we share information about, bad actor trends and what they're doing, we should also sort of share, experiences. We've had great success with sort of a low-tech innovation where, we send a postcard to an address that's been given to us, and the person seeking to register on Amazon has to send us back the code that's on that postcard, so we can verify that that's actually the address. So there's both the super high tech and then also the lower tech, more practical solutions that I think we all really need to come together and exchange and talk about and collaborate on.
Thanks. So we had a couple questions come in. One is around the question of how much does the U.S. spend on any counterfeiting, and should it be more or less? I don't know if Matt or Piat, you could take that. I know, Piat, you mentioned there is no Office of Anti-Counterfeiting anywhere, so it might be a hard number to measure. But maybe just Matt, maybe you have a sense of is this is this something we need more resources behind, or is this something where it's more about being more efficient with what we have?
Well, I would say there's first of all, there's no silver bullet, and I haven't said it so far in this panel, but I think it's pretty clear we're never going to arrest or seize our way out of the problem. So, as a law enforcement professional, I would tell you that we're not the only solution. I think consumer awareness, rights holders who use all the tools in their toolbox to assert and protect their rights, and then law enforcement being one part of that puzzle, I think is important. And Piotr talked about the importance of criminal prosecution and enforcement and deterrence. There's certainly a role, and when Krista talks about networks, I think the where we want to go is working with the willing partners to identify better networks that we can take to our prosecutors at the Department of Justice or globally to other agencies around the world, and get the right people prosecuted that will actually make a difference. So for us, this is a small part of our overarching mission. The trade enforcement is part of a larger thing that HSI does globally. It's probably 4 or 5% of our resources, but I would tell you at the same time that even if we made that 10% or 20%, I'm not sure that we could stop it just by arresting our way out of it.
Yeah. Piat, anything to add to that?
Yes, I think that the numbers that Matt just fleshed out should be also taken into perspective of the cost of counterfeiting to the U.S. economy and society, right? We are not in a position to determine what is the total cost of counterfeiting to the U.S. economy and society. We can just provide some, I would say, fraction of the total cost. But what we see is that the total volume of counterfeiting is about $460 billion. And out of this, I would say a third are fake goods that infringe IP rights of U.S. companies, right? A third of, more or less, are fake goods made in USA, or fake goods that kill U.S. innovation, that kill U.S. jobs, right? And that's just the volume. We're not talking here about impacts of innovation on job losses, impacts on criminality, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just the base raw effect of fakes that really steal U.S. intellectual property, that free ride or steal U.S. innovation. It's an enormous number. It's an enormous number that cannot be matched with any sort of expenses. And as we've been saying, it's a low risk, high profit business. I just took the liberty of checking fake AirPods, and I have so many hits. It's so easy to do it.
Right. So we just have 2 minutes left. I want to end with a question, and I'll send this to Sarah and then Krista. Kind of moving forward, we're obviously in a new administration, and we're maybe, I don't know how much more Congress will get done this year, but there's always next year. What steps would you like to see, either Congress or the Biden administration take to address counterfeits going forward? What role do you think they could play in the next 12 to 18 months?
Sure. Well, I already alluded to it. We would love to see the Informed Consumers Act pass Congress. Again, we think that is a way to really make sure that best practices on verification and disclosure occur no matter where a customer chooses to shop. And then, frankly, I think they're doing a great job via the continued work with the IPRC Center. So we really appreciate that partnership. Appreciate also our partnership with OECD, our partnership with Amazon, and thank you so much for having us. This is such an important issue. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And Krista.
Yeah, just very quickly, I echo Sarah's comments. I think we'd love to see the continuation of the great information sharing that we've got and expand on that, frankly. We'd also love to see some expanded government authority to share some of the pre-seizure enforcement related information with the private sector. I think there's some concern that the current legal frameworks might complicate that for the folks at the border, the customs folks at the border. And I think the OECD's work on sort of generating kind of global best practices is something that we're very willing to and looking forward to supporting. And to Matt's point on prosecutions, I mean, the expanding the ability for government to sort of have the benefit of what the private sector has to make stronger and more compelling cases that are able to be successfully prosecuted. We're totally aligned on that. We'd love to see those the success of those cases and those prosecutions and ever bigger networks of bad guys being taken down. But thanks to the panelists and to you as well for putting this together.
Well, thanks to all of you. Appreciate everyone who was tuning in to the conversation today. Really great work. Really glad to see everything that the industry is doing with government, the research that you're doing at OECD. I just want to flag that we have an article out today that summarizes some of the best practices and results from the National IPR Center's report. We also have a report that will be coming out soon around e-labeling that touches on some of these issues as well that I recommend for people who are interested in this issue, and look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. So thanks again to everyone for joining us, and thank you again to our panelists.